Well, thank you, and thank you all for coming out to listen to stories. It's a wonderful chance to tell stories. Stories I find come in all shapes and sizes, and I found that there are inspiration for stories in just about everything. And so I've got a variety of stories that I'd like to share with you tonight. I'm usually a folk tale teller. That's my favorite thing to do, is to tell folk tales. But I have a different story that I'd like to start with today. It's a story that I took from my brother. It's not the first thing I took from my brother. He's an older brother, and he and I were very competitive growing up. But this story is, my brother is a violinist. And one day he approached me about 5 or 6 years ago, and he said, "Brian, I would really love to do a joint gig with you, where I get to play the violin and you tell a story." And I said, "That'd be great. Do you have any stories in mind? Or do you want me to pick one and you'll find a piece of music, or you'll play some accompaniment, or how do you want to do this?" And he said, "No, I don't want to accompany you. You don't come first in this. We're going to be equals." And so he said, "Well, what I'd like to do is I've got this particular piece of music. It's called Légende, and it's by Wieniawski. It's a classical piece of music, and it's an absolutely gorgeous piece of music," he said. "And what I'd like to do is I'd like you to tell the story that comes to my mind when I play this piece of music." And I said, "Okay, that sounds to me as though you're coming first and I'm coming second, but that's okay. Tell me what the story is." So he told me a bare bones little story, and I said, "Yeah, I can take that and work with it." So I worked it up, and he had the music, and we went to a gig in Iowa where he lives. I'm thankful I'm not in Iowa, given the weather there. But he said, "You tell the story first so that people can see this in their mind, and then I'll play the music afterwards." And I said, "All right, let's try it." And so we did. And we had a wonderful time together as brothers. It was one of the few times that we haven't been competitive. And I'd like to share that story with you today. If you are interested in the music, I don't play the violin. My brother's not here. You can go on YouTube and you can type in Wieniawski or just Légende, legend with an E on the end, and you can watch 2 or 3 very talented violinists play the music, and you'll see whether it evokes the same kind of images that it did for my brother. And this is how it goes. Once, there were 2 lovers, and they were really, really interested in each other. They were deeply in love. And one particular morning, they woke up. It was a beautiful morning, much warmer than it is outside. The air was dulcet, it was calm, and there was a mist hanging over the forest that grew out right outside their house. And the 2 of them got up and they began to walk through this mist. And it was beautiful. They were holding hands, leaning into each other. And the mist would open up in front of them and close around behind them and just cocoon them in their own little world. And they were walking along for a while through the forest when all of a sudden the young man stopped. And he turned to the young woman and he looked at her. And she stopped and she looked back, and their eyes just glowed. And then they were about to start walking again when there was a cool breeze that parted the mist. And as the mist parted, they looked through and saw a house in the middle of the forest. And in front of the house was an old woman crouched down on the ground in front of a huge cauldron that was over a campfire, and it was bubbling and steaming. And the young man turned to the young woman and said, "Let's see if she'll tell us a fortune." And the young woman thought, "No, I don't really want to know a fortune." She remembered the chill that had come when the wind had parted the mist and shown them the house and the old woman. But the young man was insistent. He said, "No, what harm can it do? Let's go get a fortune." And he grabbed her hand and dragged her over to where the old woman was sitting beside the fire. And then they waited for the old woman to acknowledge them. And finally she looked up, and the young man said, "Please, please, wise mother, would you please tell us a fortune?" And she looked up at them and sort of quirked one eyebrow and smiled a bit. And then she stood up, and she reached out with her bare arms, and she put her arms on either side of that boiling cauldron, and she picked it right up off the fire. And then she turned and said, "Follow me." She turned and she walked into her house. And the young woman and the young man were a little afraid of going in, but the young man was so excited. "A fortune, we'll get a fortune." And so they walked in. And inside was a riot. The colors and the smells, there were herbs and spices all along the walls. There were crucibles on the floor. It was amazing. And the aromas in that house, the smell of cinnamon and vanilla and sage. And they watched as the old woman carried this huge cauldron to the center of that house and set it down, thunk, on the ground. And then she went and she got 2 small stools, shorter than this one, and she put them on one side of the cauldron, and then she found a third, and she put it opposite, across the cauldron from them. And she said, "Come, sit." And so they did. And then the old woman sat too on her stool, and she began to mutter and chant in a very odd language that they didn't understand at all. And then the cauldron began to glow. And the steam rising out of it got more and more and grew taller and taller and higher. And as the young couple watched, colors began to coruscate all through that steam. And the colors began to coalesce, and they began to form pictures. And then the old woman took her arm, and she wafted it through the steam. And when she did, all of the steam above her arm disappeared, but all the steam coming out of the cauldron began to writhe and coalesce, and it began to form a picture. And the young woman and the young man watched as that picture took shape. And as it did, they saw that in it there were 2 young lovers, and they were holding hands and running across a field. It was so much fun. They were laughing. They were having a great time. The field was full of flowers, and they were singing. They were so happy. And the young woman turned to the young man in the picture and said, "I love you so much. I hope our love never changes." And the young man looked back and said, "I love you too." And then the old woman took her hand and wafted it through the steam, and the image disappeared. But a new one began to form underneath where her arm had gone as that steam began to boil and turn around. And as they watched, they saw another picture form. And in it, they saw the same young man and the same young woman, but they were older now. And they heard in the background a baby crying. And the young woman was looking at the young man with anger in her face. And she was saying, "Why is it that you always..." And the young man looked back and said, "Well, why is it that you never..." And they argued back and forth and back and forth. And the baby cried in the background, unnoticed and unheard. And then the lady, the old wise woman, wafted her hand through the steam and cut it again. And again that image vanished, but another one began to form underneath. And this time, as the young couple watched, the image that formed in the steam was of an old man and an old woman. And they were sitting in rocking chairs across from each other, rocking back and forth, glaring at each other. Old, angry, alone together. And then the wise old woman wafted her hand through again, and the image vanished, and the glow faded out of the mist and out of the pot. And the young couple was left looking at the wise woman. The young woman had tears streaming down her face. And she turned to the old woman and she said, "Old mother, must it be so?" And the old woman stood up and she walked over and she knelt down between the two of them. And she looked up at the young woman and she said, "No, child. No, you asked me for a fortune, not necessarily yours." You see, the couple in the images did not want their love to change, but change it must. And when it did, they did not recognize it. And so they got angry for their loss, and they got angry at each other. And anger like that often turns to bitterness. And then she reached out and she took the young man's hand in one of her old wrinkled hands, and she took the young woman's in the other. "Treat your love gently," she said, "and with an open heart. Look for love in new ways and unexpected places. Children, the acorn looks little like the majestic oak that it becomes." And with that, she stood them up and ushered them out of her house. And they walked back out into the forest and into the mist. And the mist opened in front of them and closed around behind them. And the house and the old woman were no more. And they walked on through the forest, back toward where they lived. And as they came out of the forest, the sun broke through the mist just for a moment. And in that warmth, they stopped. And they looked at each other again. And this time, their eyes held a deeper radiance. Thank you. Thank you. So that's the story of Légende. If you want to go listen to the music and see if it evokes some different images in your mind, please look it up on YouTube and have some fun. The next story I'd like to tell you is a folktale. So I'll give you a slightly different style of stories. This is a story that comes from Vietnam. Folktales, I think, in North American culture, we're kind of used to them being what we call stories for children. We think of them as stories for children. Disney has made a lot of adult stories appropriate or somewhat appropriate for children. If you think of Cinderella, it's actually a story of two young adults wanting to get married and not really a children's story. But a lot of folktales were told by the people who thought them up. They were told as ways to understand the world, as ways to negotiate differences between people. And so the story that I have to offer you is not a happily ever after story, just to forewarn you. But it is a story about Vietnam and set in Vietnam. And I think a lot of us have sort of an idea of Vietnam that is colored by our history, the Vietnam War and such. So I want you to think back earlier than that. I want you to go back into the times before the Common Era, when Vietnam was, it still is, but it was then too, a beautiful, lush jungle country. It had huge rivers meandering through it. It had lush, dense forests and jungles. It was a beautifully green place. So picture that in your mind as you hear this story. Once upon a time in Vietnam, there lived a Mandarin. a king. And the mandarin had a very beautiful young daughter. She was so beautiful that the mandarin was a little concerned that the people in the village might fall in love with her, and so he decided to protect her. He had a huge tower built on the side of his palace. He had no windows and no doors except for one balcony way up high where she could go and she could sit and she could look out over the big river that ran beside his palace. And there, this young woman grew up. Every morning, she would go and she would sit on that balcony and she would look out and she would watch way down below her, almost so far she could barely make them out. The people of the village would come out in the morning to go fishing. And they would pole their boats up and tie them off and then begin to fish. They would lower their lines over and fish. And when the evening came, they would pick up their lines and they would untie their boats and they would go back downstream to the village. And she would watch these villagers all day, every day. And she would dream in her mind and imagine, where does that river begin? Probably up in the mountains somewhere. What does it look like as it comes chortling down the mountainside and then turns into a larger river as it comes by us? And then as it keeps going, what does it become as it reaches the sea? And she would dream about that river. She would also dream about the people who came up and down that river. And one day, one special morning, as she was watching, a new boat came up that she'd never seen before. And the young fisherman who was poling it up tied his boat up right underneath her balcony. And then he lowered his line over the edge. But instead of just sitting there and fishing, he tied his line off onto the boat. And then he picked up a bamboo flute. And he put it to his lips and he began to play. And the music of that flute wafted up into the air, and it circled around and around that tower, going higher and higher and higher, until finally it hit the ears of the young woman, and it was magic. And she sat there and listened entranced as the young man played his bamboo flute. And then he finished the song and stopped. And she was afraid that he was going to pick up his line and untie his boat and go back to the village, and she wanted more. And so she looked around, and there beside her were some flowers, and so she quickly plucked off the flower petals and scattered them out, and they wafted down, down, down toward the young man. And as he was putting his flute away, he was surrounded by a perfume of flower petals. And he looked up, and he could barely see way up high. Looked like a young woman. And it was obvious that the petals came from her. She must have liked his music. And so he picked up his flute and he played another tune. And she rewarded that tune with more flowers. And so he played and she showered flower petals down. And all day long he played his flute for her. And all day long she said thank you with flower petals. Well, that night the young man pulled in his line and untied his boat and went back to the village. And the young woman went to her bed, and I can tell you this, she didn't sleep well that night because she could not stop thinking of that young man. And she could not stop thinking of that very first song he had played for her. And she spent all night long wishing and hoping that he would return and play it again. So the next morning, she was up bright and early, waiting there on the balcony with all some new fresh flowers that she was going to give him if he played. And sure enough, he came back up, tied off his boat. He pulled out his flute and he began to play. And again, he played that first song for her. And the music went up and touched her ears, and she gave back the flower petals. Well, days went by and weeks went by, and a bond began to form between the young man and the young woman, a bond formed of his music and her love for it. And they each imagined only the best of each other. The young man couldn't see her well, but he thought surely she must be beautiful and intelligent. And the young woman looking down couldn't see him either. And she thought, well, maybe he is handsome and maybe he's a prince who's finally come to get me out of here. And they really formed a lovely bond between them. Until one day, when the young man did not arrive. You see, he had found out that it was the mandarin's daughter up in the tower. And he knew that he could not be in love with her, and he could not marry her. And so that morning he went and he fished downstream somewhere else. And all day long the young woman waited for the fisherman to come. And all day long he didn't. And as the night began to come on, just like the lotus flower does at night, she closed her heart up inside and she pulled inside herself. And as day followed day and the young man did not come back, her beauty began to wither, her life and her spirit began to die. And the mandarin was terrified. He asked the maidservant what was going on, but she was too frightened to tell him that his daughter was in love with a fisherman. And so he called all the wisest doctors, and the doctors came in. Oh, yes, we'll figure this out. And they all left confused and unsure. And as day followed day and the young woman faded, the maidservant realized that she had to have the courage to go before the mandarin and tell him the truth. And so she did. She went in and she prostrated herself in front of the mandarin and she said, "Please, I know why your daughter is failing." "Well, tell me then. Tell me why." "She's in love with a fisherman from the village." "What?" said the mandarin. "That's impossible. She cannot be in love. She cannot marry a fisherman." "Then I'm afraid," said the maidservant, "that she will die." "Well, we can't have that either," said the mandarin. "Call that fisherman and have him play for her at the base of the tower, and we'll see if he can make her love him as much as she loves his music." And so the servants went and they got the fisherman and they brought him before the mandarin. And the mandarin said, "It seems as though you have the power of life and death over my daughter." "I don't want it," said the fisherman. "All I wanted to do was play music for her." "Well, now you will," said the mandarin. "You will play for my daughter, and we'll see if she loves you as much as she loves your music." And so he took the young fisherman to the base of the tower, and he lifted that bamboo flute to his lips and he began to play. And the music, the silvery notes went out and around that tower, higher and higher and higher, until they came to the ears of the young woman, and "He's back," she thought. "My prince, my handsome prince is here to save me." And she was so excited, she ran down the circular stairs all the way to the base of the tower. She threw open the door. "He's here, my handsome prince is here." And she ran out to see him. And as she got closer, she realized that he was just a humble fisherman. And as she tried to thank him for his music, she turned away. The young fisherman realized that she did not love him. And so he too turned away. And he went back to his home in the village. And that night he died of a broken heart. And the next morning, when all of his friends came to go fishing with him, they found not his body, but a huge crystal on his mat where he slept. And they said, "Surely this is a symbol of his love for that young woman. Let's put it on his boat." And so they took it and they affixed it to the prow of his boat. And then they picked up his flute. And they thought he always loved that river. And so they took the flute and they threw it into the river and watched it float downstream. And then they got in the boat and went fishing. Well, days passed, and they would go out every day fishing in this boat with this enormous crystal on the top. And one day the mandarin was out in his barge, and he saw this boat come by, and he saw this huge crystal, and he thought, where did that come from? And so he called the fishermen to him and said, tell me, where did you get this amazing jewel? And so they told him the story. And he said, that would be a good gift for my daughter. And so he bought it from the fisherman for a wonderful sum of money. And he took it to the jeweler, and he said, take this crystal and turn it into a teacup for my daughter. And so the weeks passed, and the jeweler worked and worked and worked that jewel, and finally had a beautiful teacup made from it. And when it was done, the mandarin went up to his daughter's room, up there in the balcony. She had been cured, but something special had gone from her life. And he took it to her, and he said, daughter, I would like you to have this teacup. And she said, thank you, Father, but I would like to be alone when I drink from it. And so the mandarin left. And the young woman took that teacup and went back out onto the balcony where she had spent so many wonderful days, listening to the young fisherman, listening to the flute. And as she sat there, she took her teapot and she poured tea into that teacup. And when it settled, she could see on the surface of the tea the face of the fisherman. And very softly, she could hear that song that he had played for her. And in that moment, her heart broke too. She didn't come down for lunch. She didn't come down for dinner. And eventually, the mandarin and all of the court went up around those spiral stairs all the way to the top. And when they got to the top, they opened the door and went inside, and they saw that the young woman was seated on the balcony. And they saw that her spirit had left her. And in the silence, they could hear the sound of a woman softly weeping and the gentle music of a fisherman's flute. Thank you. How are you doing, Anton? Thank you. Okay. Well, I can't tell you a whole evening of unhappy stories. So let me tell you one that is actually what's called an urban legend. So urban legends are stories that have a very different storytelling style. They're usually told in a more informal, conversational kind of style. And they're legends in the sense that they are usually set in a particular place. As academics, we often write articles that nobody reads. We go to conferences that very few people attend, but we think we're very important by doing it. And so this is a story about a friend of mine who was also an academic. And he was newly married, and he ended up going to a conference down in Texas. And he told me this story afterwards. But the conference, when he was down there, he went to the conference. It was an academic conference. He was somewhat bored and somewhat intrigued. And by the end of it, he was feeling, I really miss my wife. And I'd like to take her something that would show her how much I missed her. So when he got to the airport for his flight back, he began to walk through all of the shops, all of the little boutiques. And first he went to the bookstore because he knew his wife loved books. And he thought, oh, I'll get her a book. I know she likes these kinds of books. And so he looked, and all the books were sort of old and torn and dog-eared. And he thought, I don't want to take those. And he couldn't find anything that he really liked. So he left, and he went out to the next store. And the next store was a flower store. And he thought, oh, well, certainly I can find a lovely set of flowers to take for her. But all of the flowers were refrigerated, and they were all kind of old, and the petals were drooping, and he thought, no, that's not appropriate for the love I feel for her. And so he left, And he went on down the terminal, and he kept going into all of the different little shops and boutiques looking for something to take his wife, and he couldn't find anything that he thought was worthy of her. And as he was walking along, he got more and more depressed, and he was thinking, I'm going to have to go home empty-handed, when all of a sudden, the most amazing aroma wafted through the air and across his nose, and he thought, that's an amazing smell. I wonder what it is. It smells like cookies. And so he followed his nose all the way down through the airport to the far end of the terminal, and there, perched at the very end, was a small boutique. And across the glass window, etched into the glass window, were the words, "The best cookies in the world." And he thought, my, if these cookies taste as good as they smell, this is the perfect gift for my wife. She loves chocolate chip cookies. I'll get her some of those. So he got in line, and there was a line, and he waited and waited, and finally it was his turn, and he came up to this incredible display of cookies behind the glass counter. There were all sorts of cookies. There were brownies, there were oatmeal cookies, and there were the chocolate chips. His wife's favorite. Big, beautiful, succulent cookies. And he got up to the cashier and he said, "Excuse me, do your cookies taste as good as they smell?" And the lady behind the cash register looked at him and smiled and said, "Sir, these are the best cookies in the world." And he said, okay, I'll believe you. I'd like half a dozen of the chocolate chip cookies. If you could box them up for me, that would be great. And so she did, and he reached down and picked up his briefcase and picked up his newspaper, and then he walked off to the terminal. Well, he got to the terminal, and it was very busy, and I don't know about you all, but whenever I go to the airport and I go to the terminal and you look out over the crowded terminal, you don't want to sit right next to somebody, right? You want at least one space between you and the next person just for a little elbow room. And so he scanned out over the audience, or over the people gathered there in the terminal, and he thought, there's one seat. And he made a beeline for it. And he sat down and he looked, and sure enough, there was an empty seat beside him. And then there was a middle-aged woman with her two young children sitting there. And he thought, perfect. I've got enough space to spread out a little bit. And he put down his stuff and he opened up his newspaper and he began to read. Well, time went by and the airplane didn't arrive. And then the smell of those cookies began to come back and get into his nose. And he began to think, I really don't want to take my wife cookies that don't taste very good. Maybe I should try one and make sure. So he reached over and he opened up the box and he took out one of those cookies and he began to eat it, and it was amazing. And he thought, this is great. This is going to make a perfect gift. And as he was eating that cookie, out of the corner of his eye, he saw the woman who was 2 seats over reach over and pick up one of his cookies and begin to eat it. He was stunned. The nerve of the lady, but he was so embarrassed for her that he couldn't face her. And so he finished eating his cookie and continued to read his newspaper. Well, time went by and the airplane didn't arrive, and he began to think about it a little bit more, and he thought, well, this is crazy. Nobody ever buys 4 cookies. You buy 3, you buy half a dozen, you buy a dozen, maybe a baker's dozen if you're lucky, but nobody ever buys 4. So if I eat 1, I'll take her the other 3, and then we'll be good. So he reached over and he picked up that cookie and he began to eat it. And it was amazing. He thought, okay, I'll take my wife the other 3. And out of the corner of his eye, he saw the woman reach over and take not 1, but 2 of his cookies and hand them to her children. And they began to eat them as well. Well, he couldn't believe it. He just simply couldn't believe it. And he was so angry inside, but he couldn't face her. And so he continued to read his newspaper. But as he did, he began to think, I'll be damned if she'll get that last cookie. And so he reached out, and his hand sort of paused over it as he was about to pick it up. And she reached out, and her hand paused over it at the same time. And the hand just sort of waited there in midair. And finally, he had to face her. And so he looked at her, expecting that she would look away. But she didn't. She looked at him and she smiled. And then she reached down and she picked up the cookie and broke it in half and gave him half and began to eat the other half. Well, that was it. He was so furious. He had nothing now to take his wife. He stuffed that half cookie into his mouth and picked up his briefcase, tucked his newspaper under his arm, and stomped across to the edge of the terminal where the gate was. And he stood there fuming until the airplane finally arrived. And he couldn't wait. He had to be the first one on that plane. He just had to get out of there. He was so upset. So he was first in line, and he handed in his ticket. And the lady looked at him and thought something was wrong with him because his face was all flushed and he was angry and he had this growl on his face. And she just let him in as fast as she could. And he took his ticket and he stomped down that gangway just full of fury. He walked in. He didn't say hello to anybody. Just walked to his chair, found his chair, sat down in his chair, opened up that silly little tray table in front of him, slammed down his briefcase, opened up his briefcase, and there was his box of cookies. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, I'd like to finish with one last story. This is also a folk tale. It's a Jewish folk tale about a very learned scholar, a teacher, by the name of Zusha. And it goes like this. You see, Zusha was very, very wise. And he had a huge following of people who wanted to learn from him because he was also a renowned teacher. And so the people of the village would come and they would sit, and Zusha would come and he would talk to them and he would educate them and he would transfer knowledge to them. And they were in awe of his wisdom and his intellect. And so it stunned them one day when Zusha came to talk to them and his eyes were red and tears were running down his face. And the people said, "Zusha, what is wrong?" And Zusha said, "I have had a vision. I have had a vision of what the angels will ask me when I die." And the people looked at Zusha and said, "But Zusha, you are wise, you are pious, you are humble. What question could the angels possibly ask you that would frighten you this badly?" And Zusha said, "The angels will not ask me, 'Why were you not Moses leading your people out of slavery?'" "Okay," said the people, "but what question will they ask you?" And Zusha, again, tears streaming down his face, said, "The angels will not ask me, 'Why were you not Joshua leading your people into the promised land?'" "Okay," said the people, "but what question will they ask you?" And with tears streaming down his face, Zusha replied, "When I die, the angels will ask me, 'Zusha, why were you not Zusha?'" Thank you.